dealt with on page 2, and the meeting was taken up with this committee getting an understanding of what the privileges of the Senate entails, and I welcome Senator Fraser Binns and Senator Scott Motley. So that was on page 2. We continued on to page 3, looking at the question of privileges, and indeed looking at a paper prepared as page 3, continued on 4, 5, 6, and the meeting was adjourned at 10:05. So, Senator Sinclair, would you move for the adoption of the minutes?
I so move.
Seconded by Senator Scott Motley. Thank you. So as I indicated in relation to matters arising, this is a topic that the Deputy Chair took last meeting, and I'm going to ask him to just continue now because there are some matters arising that he wants to deal with.
All right, thank you. We had ended on the last occasion, I believe, Senator Cavan Gale, you had indicated, having gone through what were identified as the powers, no, not powers and privileges of the Senate. I believe yourself and Senator Fitzhenley had indicated that they wish to have raised some Fitzhenley. All right. But for myself, Senator Morris, you hearing me? All right. Historically, because I was not here and I was trying to follow what was said on a previous occasion where when the query was made in relation to the matters going before the Committee of Privileges. I believe yourself and the substantive chairman had raised an issue, one particular issue that went to that committee. And I was just trying to fathom what particular, whether maybe from the standing orders, from the legislation that deals with the Senate and House of Representatives power and privileges legislation which we were given, and any part of the Constitution, that particular matter that would have gone there and ended in a result, what particular provision was dealt with? Was it dealt with under? Are you hearing me, Senator Morris?
Mr. Chair, I think what had happened at the time is that reference was made to Mace to see how such matters were treated. And as I had indicated before, what the committee, just the essence of the argument is that because the member had committed to give the president the document and never followed up on her commitment, that was a matter that brought the Senate in disrepute. So, you know, there was a there was a document that was prepared, and that can be retrieved and examined. But that was the essence of the argument from my recollection. You know, so that's where it's at.
Okay, I was just trying to fathom, because I understood the circumstances, but as to how I read the particular standing order, which, and how it is written, where it is matters that affect the powers or privileges of the Senate. And the powers and privileges of the Senate was what was presented to us, and we went through last week.
Yeah, because that was a privilege matter, because, you know, when a member has a document, right? If that member refuses to give the president the document, there's nothing that the president can do. And that is something that Senator Arthur Williams, who was the opposition representative on the committee at the time, made very clear, and everybody agreed to that, you know, because that was a privilege of the member in terms of a right to ownership of the document. But the moment that she decided to share the document, then, you know, she gave up her right there, so to speak.
I see. Sorry, Senator Fraser Binns, your microphone was on before, so.
It's a direct question based on what Senator Morris said. Mine is a little different.
All right, so
So I'll yield to him.
Senator Cavangale.
Thank you, Chair. So, directed to Senator Professor Floyd Morris, was it the situation where, in that particular case, she had offered or indicated that she would have presented the document, and that caused her to have waived her rights?
All right, before you answer that, Senator Morris.
Okay.
I just want to say this. I don't want to.
No, I'm just seeking clarity based on what he has said.
But I don't want us to give the impression that we are trying the circumstances.
No.
I'm just trying to understand.
That was never my intention, Chief.
Right, how it became classified under
As privilege.
a power
Under
or
privilege.
privilege. And before you answer,
but-
Senator Morris, and Senator Scott Matley is here with a legal mind, and Senator Fraser Binns, whether a person who may have indicated waiver, as has been said, of a right to a control of a document, if we were to just use that as an example, hypothetically, if we want to refer to it as, and there is no prejudice incurred, no adverse situation incurred, can't they withdraw? A person could withdraw. Would they have the right to withdraw the waiver that they would have given? So you can, if there's no prejudice, if you can think about it. But Senator Morris, you can go ahead, Senator Morris, in response to Member Gill.
Remember, you know, that there was a disciplinary action, Chairman, because the member was suspended from the Senate, and those disciplinary matters would have to go to the Privileges Committee. And it was at that point the fulcrum of the case was heard, which those issues were indicated. And there was an example that was pointed from my recollection of another case with former Prime Minister Bruce Golding, but I think he was acting in his substantive capacity as a member of parliament, I think. And the speaker had asked him for the document that he was quoting from, and he refused to hand over the document to the speaker. He said no. And there was nothing that could be done in that instance, right? This particular case is different in that, is the converse, in that, you know, a request was made for me to get a copy, and she said, certainly, yes, sir. And subsequent to that, she never followed up after I made requests for the document thereafter. So that was what happened, Senator Gill.
Okay. So, Senator Scott Matley, and I said we're not trying the matter, just trying to understand when I looked on what was given to us as powers or privileges of the Senate, to see what circumstances would fall within this description as set out in Standing Order 68. And I will say, before you actually respond, because it says, what shall be referred to this committee is matters which affects the powers or privileges. So it is something that is affecting the powers or privileges that is given to the Senate, as I read it here. And what was presented in the papers, you weren't here last week, right? Refer to the powers and privileges of the Senate as set out in the relevant sections of the Constitution, the relevant sections of the Standing Orders, and the relevant sections of the Senate and House of Representatives powers and privileges legislation. And as I said, just trying to fit a historical matter into this particular provision. If I agree to a position, nothing else was done which would have created an adverse situation by me either doing or not doing. And I say, you know, I've changed my mind. How would it have affected powers or privileges of the Senate, that it would be a matter that would be referred to the committee? And that's what I'm trying to fathom.
Yeah, well, thank you, Chair. This is not a fully considered position, of course, but I would imagine that if the privilege exists, you have the right way. I don't think you have the privilege of changing your mind. I think you're bound in the same way that how they put is the Erskine May, where in describing the parliamentary privilege as a sum of the peculiar rights enjoyed by each house collectively as a constituent part of the High Court of Parliament and by members of each house individually, without which they could not discharge their functions and which exceed those possessed by other bodies or individuals. With the rights are also attached certain responsibilities. And one of them, I would assume, would be that people could rely on you to be a person of your word. So I don't think you could waive your privilege and then decide to take it back, which is, even if there's no adverse. And certainly, I think that you can determine by yourself that having looked at it now, there are no adverse repercussions, that it is the fact that you're going to pass it over now that others would determine whether or not it is adverse. So I think that for me, I would focus on the commitment which was made, the waiver of that privilege. And I think that it would impact very negatively both on the person and on the Senate if somebody were to be able to say, I said I would do it, but now I've changed my mind. That's just my instinctive reaction.
Thank you for those
Absolutely.
words. All right. So in relation to the particulars, any other comment? Senator Fraser-Binns, I believe you wanted to comment, but you're going on to a different issue.
Are we finished with this particular issue raised by Senator Morris? Yes. Chairman, thanks. The question that I have, I'd raise it at the second to last sitting, as it relates to the privilege. So if the privilege is mine, then I am trying to understand. Let me rephrase it. So if the privilege is mine, then I do not understand why it should be voted on, because the privilege, there are general privileges and then there are special privilege or specific privileges. So if the privilege is an individual privilege, say for example, in Senator Morris's case, he has privilege are rights, include rights. So he has a right to information which will allow him to exercise his duty as a senator, i.e. to participate in a debate. And if it is that he has not been provided with those documents, case in point, then it is a privilege that is being breached, or a right which is being breached. The challenge I have, therefore, is trying to understand why then would we need to, one, vote on whether there is a breach, and two, refer to a committee. And something that I'm seeing from the notes is that the committee's recommendation do not have to be followed by the House, in this case by the Senate. So, Chairman, I wondered if we could have a little discussion or lend our minds to it a little, because my own thinking is that if it is an individual right, then it ought not to be voted upon. And it should not be sent to a committee, but even if it's sent to a committee, then I do not understand why the Senate the Senate does not have to abide by the findings of the committee. Per the notes here, I'm not sure if that obtains in Jamaica, but in the Australian model, there's no need for it. But I didn't see anything. Miss Brandon is the one who did the article. Can you just direct
us to where you're...
Okay. No, Chairman, the earlier points was just my own thoughts. But on the last page of the submission,
it
says House of Parliament of Jamaica, Parliamentary Privilege, the submission that was done by, is it Ms. Brandon who did it? Who did this? Chairman, may I ask?
It was read by...
No, who did this document? Who prepared this document?
A former legal counsel, but Ms. Brandon had read it into the record on the last occasion.
Yes, I saw the minutes.
That's why you see the reference.
Right, I saw the minutes, but I was talking about the actual document. Well, thanks to Ms. Brandon and the former counsel for that. Right, so Chairman, the last question is on page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It says, the last paragraph says, notwithstanding, the House is not obliged to follow the findings and recommendations of the committee. And I surmise it is a committee of privileges. So that is something I was just asking as a matter of knowledge. I'm not sure what obtains in Jamaica. But the substantive point I'm asking for us to have a discussion is, if the privilege, particularly that individual right that a member of the Senate has, if that right is breached, then why must it be voted upon? Because, you know, again, I'm going to use Senator Morris's case with the NIDS bill. Senator Morris, because of his visual impairment, was not provided with the documents so he could properly avail himself and review the documents so he could contribute to the debate. And he raised the motion, he raised the issue that his privilege has been abused. The matter then, of course, as is provided in the Senate order, there was a motion, and the motion, the debate was had, and they voted against it. They voted against Senator Morris' privilege. And I found it a little disturbing because, and this is not specific to Senator, but I'm just using the instant case. Because if he's saying, I have a challenge, and because of my challenge, I have to be provided with the documents by X time so that I can do my duty as a senator, but the documents were not provided, I don't know why anyone should vote against him, saying, you didn't get the documents, but hey, you know, your privilege has not been breached. I'm having a little challenge understanding it, Chair, so I think it is more for us to have a conversation whether an issue like that, which is a privilege, should be something once invoked is accepted and dealt with, or whether we should allow it to be voted upon by the members, regrettably, who vote on party line.
I'm just trying to, okay, a motion, and that would take us back to 26. Where, pardon me? Okay, sorry.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I'm listening to the conversation, and I think it would be very important if we actually define what constitutes a privilege. So I have Section 3 of the Senate and House of Representatives Powers and Privileges Act, which states that no civil or criminal proceedings may be instituted against any member for words spoken before or written in a report to the House of which he is a member, or to a committee thereof, or to any joint committee, or by reason of any matter or thing brought by him therein by a petition, bill, resolution, motion, or otherwise. Section 4 also states that for the duration of the session, members shall enjoy freedom from arrest for any civil debt, except a debt the contraction of which constitutes a criminal offense. Erskine May also goes on to state that parliamentary privilege is the sum of peculiar rights enjoyed by each house collectively as a constituent part of the High Court of Parliament and by members of each house individually, which they could not discharge their functions and which exceed those possessed by other bodies or individuals. Thus, privilege, though part of the law of the land, is to a certain extent an exemption from the general law. Certain rights and immunities, such as freedom from arrest or freedom of speech, belong primarily to individual members of each house and exist because the house cannot perform its functions without unimpeded use of the services of its members. Other such rights and immunities, such as the power to punish for contempt and the power to regulate its own constitution, belong primarily to each house as a collective body for the protection of its members and the vindication of its own authority and dignity. Fundamentally, however, it is only as a means to the effective discharge of the collective functions of the house that the individual privileges are enjoyed by members.
If I may, and I thank you so much, Ms. Lowe, because I did read both, and I think that the fact that you read it into the record supports the point I'm making, because you have the collective and you have the individual. So the case in point I'm talking about is the individual. you talk about peculiar rights, which is a distinctive or a special right that a person has. And each right, I mean, you have the collective, such as freedom from arrest. And then you have the individual, like in Senator Floyd's case, which he needs to carry out his function as a senator. Yes? So I don't think that the point I'm making or the query that I'm seeking, well, the issue that I'm trying to ventilate, that it departs in any way from the definition found in the House and Senate Privileges Act, or certainly in Erskine May. In fact, what I think it does is that it supports the point I'm making that the rights are collective and they are also individual, but the sum total of these rights, whether individually or collectively, is for the better functioning of the Senate. So the question, therefore, is, again, using the case of Senator Morris, is if this peculiar right, this distinctive, this individual right has been breached in his estimation, then why do we then have to, one, have the motion, and two, vote against it? Because if somebody invokes that their right has been breached, then I don't believe it is something for us to vote on. In fact, if anything, I believe once that has been invoked, then it should be sent to the committee where it can be discussed and a determination made there. So it ought not to be a motion that is discussed in the Senate and then decide whether we should send it to the Committee of Privileges. If I say, Mr. President, my right has been, my right or my privilege has been breached, then I believe that that should be sufficient for it to be sent to the Privileges Committee for a determination to be made. That's my position.
Very good.
Senator Scott.
And it might be that because of the member who claimed that his privilege, his right had been I'm sorry, I was a little distracted. Might be because of that, where it was pellucid in the circumstances that there had to be no real debate about his privilege, because we could all see what was happening. And we ourselves had the documents on the table, so there was no debate about it. That it highlights that there could be circumstances like that, where it is clear that there has been an interference with the privilege. And I think that is what Senator Fraser-Benz is pointing to. Why, in that instance, why does it therefore have to go through a particular process? Now, I can understand in another circumstance, Chair, for example, where he's saying it's debatable. So you are claiming that your freedom of speech has been breached. Then we can get into a discussion about, was it in fact, were there rules which were being observed? Were you going too far? Was a matter sub judice? You know, if giving examples. But in this instance, it was really not debatable. And the issue which I think is being raised is, in circumstances where there can be no debate and where no other person can really be part of the interpretation, because it's such a personal privilege, ought it to be sent to the committee? As of right.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Senator Morris. And I'm just saying, I'm still trying to, when I read 68, right? 68, and even reflecting on 26 and how it is written. I don't know if Ms. provides any other assistance, Madam Law, if Ms. provides any other assistance in relation to by giving examples, whether it is the example that is being used that speaks to Senator Morris Morris's personal capacity, whether that is one that falls within 26, and if there is an issue that speaks to that particular point that Senator Fraser-Binns made, referring to Senator Morris, that in relation to circumstances that surrounds that or any other type of example that could be found, it may not be closed, that it goes to a committee to have a discussion, debate, and probably rules are then set out that comes back to the Senate to be approved, agreed, and that is what the presentation may have been making reference to, which then says that the House is not obliged to follow the findings and recommendations of the committee, because in a particular specific situation that you're dealing with Senator Morris, a recommendation may come back to say public business or the particular bill, if it's a bill, would have to be put off for XYZ period, or the specific time is given. Something may come up that you don't have to agree on. It may be adjusted, or one may say, no, it's not going to be accepted. The legislation that is referred to, and Ms. Lowe read, made specific reference to 3 and 4, right? Those are specific. Pardon me? Right. So we're clear on those. But, and when you read 26, it speaks to privileges of the Senate. So if I were, for example, on my way here, trying to make my way into the Senate to participate and carry on my functions. And sometimes I get the benefit of it. Yes, when they see that equal yellow tag on the vehicle. All right.
Yeah. But 26 is also tied to 68.
Go again? Go again,
I'm saying 26 is also tied to
yes.
To 68.
Yes, but you notice how 26 is written. It says privileges of the Senate, which is the body.
Yeah. But Mr. Chair, there's a point that I wanted to make, because the point is that the Privileges Committee, as I indicated earlier, hears all matters relating to privileges of the Senate, and that those matters can be either disciplinary in nature or otherwise, okay? And I think you are trying to find out why was the matters referred to the Privileges Committee. And in this instance, Senator Sophia Fraser-Binns, I think, made a very brilliant intervention here, pointing out to this particular case. And you would recall that in the NIDS case, what had happened, there were 3 documents in contention. There was the substantial document, which was very voluminous in terms of the bill. And then there was another document outlining a set of matrix for amendment to the legislation. And then on the morning, another document was sent with a set of amendments to amend the amendments, right? And therein lies the conundrum, because one has to remember that I have a visual disability, And even though I have the technology doesn't allow me to interact with the three documents simultaneously. It would allow me to interact with two of the documents. And in any operation where persons with disabilities are concerned, there's what is called reasonable accommodation in international law. In our legislation, it has reasonable arrangement. Wherein once the individual makes a request for assistance, that is a person with a disability, that assistance must be provided to accommodate the particular disability. So it is within that context that I looked at the legislation at the time and asked for reasonable accommodation, and ties into privilege. And as Senator Sophia Fraser Bin said, that was put to a vote, and you cannot vote on one's privilege.
Go ahead, Senator Scott.
I want to say firstly that although we are looking at the legislation is very narrow and restrictive. And if that were all it was, we would not need to be having this discussion at all, because it confines it to the fact that for the duration of the session, members shall enjoy freedom from arrest for any civil debt, except a debt the contraction of which constitutes a criminal offense. This section, which we are looking at, section 26, which deals with privileged motions, it is quite clear, does not contemplate that restricted approach. Because certainly at 26.2, well, one says that once it concerns the privileges of the Senate, it takes precedence over all public businesses. But 2 says, if during a sitting of the Senate a matter suddenly arises which appears to involve the privileges of the Senate and which calls for the immediate intervention of the Senate, the proceedings may be interrupted, save during the course of a division by a motion based on such matter. But so how do I try to resolve it? I look at what May is contemplated, because May described the parliamentary privilege as basically the sum of the peculiar rights which are enjoyed by both houses, without which they could not discharge their function.
Right.
So the question which we have to be looking at is, what are the kinds of privileges that could prohibit a member from being effectively able to discharge their functions? So it is a broader concept.
Absolutely. So me not having access to documents will impede my ability to execute my parliamentary responsibility.
And the last point I want to make is in that section, which is highlighted. It says, fundamentally, however, it is only as a means to the effective discharge of the collective functions of the House that the individual privileges are enjoyed by members. So it takes me back again to, what is it that you could possibly enjoy that taken by yourself could impact on the way that the House is functioning? And so I think that is where we need to focus a little bit to determine whether or not there needs to be more clarity about how the standing order ought to reflect the privilege right, or what.
And I think you have expressed it well, Senator Scott Martin. But it's the S, right?
Chair.
Yes.
Yeah.
Senator Langmore.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies for running a little bit late this morning. I think I'm catching the drift of the conversation, but may I expand the thought in terms of the definition of privileges, especially with respect to Professor Morris's situation. And I do fully recognize the import of your access to the documentation and such. Considering the nature of the matters that we deal with, sometimes the urgencies of the legislations that we have to process, perhaps privileges in Professor Morris's context could also expand to a reader, someone appointed by the House to provide the privilege of reading the actual amendments. Since the software only accommodates and is limited, his impairment is visual. He has very good auditory function, and so could be receptive to the material in that way also, prior to his presence in the Senate or in the sit-in. Just for the expedience of the order of the business. I'm saying this to say that I think that there are, in considering privileges, we also have to widen our thoughts, broaden our thoughts to the specific individual and what might be needed to accommodate participation fulsomely. So a reader, in my mind, could also, who is clearly officiated in that manner, could also be a solution to the problem.
Thank you, Chair. Oh, sorry.
Hold a
Please
second.
go ahead, Ms. Lowe. Please go ahead,
first,
Ms. Lowe.
and then
Absolutely.
Senator Fraser-Baines.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just to revisit the point that I earlier made about providing a definition for privilege, it would cover scenarios that would include Senator Morrison's position in terms of him not being able to discharge his functions. So if we provide a definition about the rights to freedom of speech, etc., and to also include that the right also extends itself for persons to be able to enjoy it so that they can discharge their functions, then I believe that would sufficiently cover the many scenarios that could evolve in the future and protect the individual
Absolutely.
rights.
It covers it.
Chairman.
It's just that.
I think we're looking, and probably I'm wrong, but you're looking on a personal situation.
Yeah,
and
Chairman,
then you have the privilege of the Senate, which is, can the Senate carry out its function as against an individual? And so that is why when I say I read 26 and it speaks, it's not speaking, it doesn't make any reference to members, you know. It says the privileges of the Senate. So, go ahead, Senator.
Thank you,
Fraser.
Chairman. And because I specifically raised the issue of Senator Morris because I think most of us recall that. But I don't want the conversation to be limited to that one instance. Because the general point I want to make is, apart from the very clear ones that we find in the Act that talks about freedom from arrest and those things, the main issue in my mind is where a privilege is personal to a senator, but it affects that senator's ability to discharge the functions of the Senate or his or her function, then, you know, how do we treat with that? So it's not just limited to Floyd's example, but just privileges that are individual. That's one. Second, Chairman, is, I'm coming, Floyd. The second issue is, and I know we're dealing with one point, but I do want us to look at whether once a member cites or states that his privilege has been breached, whether that should be something discussed at the Senate level or whether it should go to the Privileges Committee for a discussion and then referred to the Senate for final decision. I think I want us to have some discussion on that because, again, because that is the only example I know. We saw what happened in Floyd's case. It may be the right thing, but it may not be the right thing. My personal view is it ought to go directly to the committee for the matter to be ventilated, because it could be something such as freedom of speech. And that is something that you have to discuss at the Privileges Committee, because even though, forget the Privileges Committee for a minute, but every Jamaican has a right to freedom of speech. But within that right, you have responsibilities. So if a member were to evoke that their right to freedom of speech in the Senate has been breached or has been impacted to the extent they can't contribute, I think we have to go to the committee where we discuss whether that right has been breached, and if the breach has been done, whether it is such that is demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. But I mean, you get the point I'm making, Chair. So I think the committee
in this instance,
is
it's
where the
access
matter.
to information. So
I'm coming, Floyd. Senator Morris, sorry. I think the committee is where the discussion should take place, and not a preliminary decision taken at a Senate level by way of a motion.
Sorry, before you go on, Senator Scott Marley, Senator Lamar.
Thank you, thank you. I just wanted to put in context my consideration as the clerk raised, because like I said, I'm catching up. My suggestion is particularly around persons who may have some impairment of whatever nature. And the reason I thought of it is what happens in our school system when kids are doing their PEP exams. If a child has a unique learning issue, is requiring their handwriting, they have a dysgraphia or something like that, or they're unable to complete the task in a particular time, they're provided with privileges. They're provided with accommodations that are unique to them. So my dispensation was not specific only to Professor Morris. It is, I used that example based on what the discussion was before. But my overall point is that the precedence is set for us to have a consideration for the unique individual and what might be needed for their unique dispensation. Thank you.
Senator Morris.
Yes, just to say that, I mean, I pointed out that earlier. That's what I talk about when I mention reasonable arrangement. That there's a whole slew of literature and information about that. So, you know, I mean, confining it to a reader is not just the only option that should be placed on the table. But there are other issues that should be examined.
All right. Yes, and I want to just kind of come to a point where we're going to think about it during the...
But I wanted to ask one question. I don't recall what happened on that particular date. But what happens to the matter which is being debated in those circumstances? Like, with this particular one, it was a privilege which was raised in particular to a capacity to access legislative amendments. So where that privilege is raised in the middle of the debate, have you given any contemplation to how it would be resolved?
Let me give you an example of something that happened just last week, a week before. Recall when the bills were not here, the Customs Act?
Yes.
And the one in relation to the amendment of the Constitution. The Senate could not function. They would not have known what was before it, right?
What was stable.
What was stable. Mm-hmm. And the president accepted the position that was put forward to say that we couldn't carry out our function. The Senate could not carry out its function. And I believe that that is how this particular section is looking at it.
Right.
But so, I think, and as you have said, Senator Scott Marley, which I think you captured it well, which is that we have to look at it where it impacts the individual and whether that impact on an individual impacts the function.
Yes, that was what my summation would be.
Right. And I think that is how we're going to close off today, and we give it some thought and reflect on that in respect to whether SO 68, as it is written, is satisfactory, whether 68 needs any amendment, and or whether we need to add a 68B or something to that effect to deal with other specific types of situation. And it has to always be looked at with 26 in mind. I don't know who is a research person, Ms. Lowe? Who is a research person? Research persons. If we can see what may exist in respect to specific examples, if it can be found in other jurisdictions in relation to how 68 or similar provisions that are similar to ours, 68, what it covers, and also when it refers to privileges of the Senate, what is that? As against a particular situation that may exist. So I thank members for being here, participating, and probably what we thought was one of those easy standing orders to run through and to agree. I am telling you. But it is interesting that we have this committee and that it opens our eyes to the fact that what may have been acceptable many, many years ago, when these standing orders would have come about, I believe 1964 or thereabout, 62, that yes, that one also. In fact, I just took the opportunity at the time, just to type in the words and it came up because I wasn't aware of it. Yep. All right. Okay. All right. So thank you very much for coming, and it is now 10:07, and we will move on adjournment of Standing Orders Committee meeting. Can I get a motion for adjournment, please? Thank you, Senator Scott Motley, Senator Longmore. Thank you very much. Standing Orders Committee adjourned.